What if I told you that the knights you read about in storybooks, the ones who swore sacred oaths to protect women and defend the defenseless, were often the ones committing the worst atrocities of medieval warfare? Here's a fact that will blow your mind. According to military historians studying medieval warfare customs, sexual violence during city sackings was so systematized that it was literally factored into pre-battle negotiations. Cities deciding whether to surrender would explicitly weigh this threat. If that just made you think, wait, chivalry was supposed to prevent this, then you're about to have everything you believed about knights completely shattered. You're going to absolutely hate what's coming next, but you need to hear it. Because the code of chivalry that we romanticize today had a dark, deliberately hidden clause. It only applied to certain women. Everyone else, they were fair game, and the knights knew it. Hey friends, tonight we'll walk right through the heart of medieval warfare's darkest secret. What really happened to women when knights conquered cities. Before you get comfortable, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before we begin, a necessary note. What we're about to discuss involves documented historical accounts of war crimes, including sexual violence used as a weapon of war. This content is educational, based on primary historical sources and academic research, and presented to counter the romanticized myths about medieval warfare that persist today. If this content is difficult for you, please take care of yourself. Resources are available in the description. The goal here isn't shock value, it's historical truth. These events happened. These people suffered, and understanding that reality is crucial to ensuring we don't sanitize history in ways that make future atrocities easier to ignore. You were told that knights were heroes, that chivalry meant honor, restraint, and the protection of the innocent. But tonight we're going to talk about what those same knights actually did when the gates fell, and their commanders gave them 24 hours of freedom. This isn't the sanitized version you learned in school. This is the truth that got edited out of every legend, every song, and every romantic story about the age of chivalry. So let's dive into what really happened behind those castle walls. Sexual violence and pillage, the darkest truth of war. You were told that knights protected women, that chivalry meant defending the defenseless, that honor demanded restraint, and then you stood in a conquered city and watched what actually happened, what you participated in, or witnessed, or failed to stop. Because here's the truth, they'll never put in the songs. Sexual violence wasn't an unfortunate side effect of medieval warfare. It was a weapon, a strategy, a reward. And knights, those supposed protectors of women, were often the ones wielding it. Let's be absolutely clear about what we're discussing. This isn't about individual acts by rogue soldiers. This was systematic, organized, expected. When a medieval city fell after resistance, what followed was called sacking, and sacking had rules unwritten, but universally understood. The soldiers got a set period, usually 24 to 48 hours, to take whatever they wanted: gold, food, livestock, valuables, and women. According to military historians studying medieval warfare customs, sexual violence during sackings was so common that it was factored into pre-battle negotiations. Cities deciding whether to surrender would weigh this explicitly: surrender now and be spared, or resist and face everything that followed. The threat wasn't subtle. It was deliberate, calculated, terror as policy. Here's how it worked in practice. Your army breaches the walls, the city falls, resistance collapses, and your commander, that paragon of chivalry, gives the order: the city is yours, 24 hours. What happens next isn't chaos. It's organized horror. Soldiers spread through the city systematically, house by house, street by street. They're looking for valuables, yes, but they're also looking for women. In medieval law, both military custom and actual legal codes offered women no protection. According to legal texts from the period, women in a conquered city that had resisted were considered spoils of war, not people, property, and soldiers were permitted to treat them accordingly. One legal scholar from 14th century France wrote, "That which is taken by force in war belongs to the taker, whether gold or flesh." Flesh, that's the word he used. Women were equated with livestock. Let me give you specifics, because generalities let you look away. During the sack of Limoges in 1370, ordered by Edward, the Black Prince, that celebrated night, the chronicler Froissart documented what happened. He described soldiers entering homes, dragging women and girls into the streets, committing acts of violence he struggled to put into words. He noted that neither age nor condition provided sanctuary. Translation: children weren't spared. Neither were the elderly. Neither were nuns in convents. The Crusaders' sack of Jerusalem in 1099 was even worse. Muslim chronicles and even some Christian ones describe mass sexual violence alongside the massacre. Women were assaulted in their homes, in mosques, and the streets. Some killed themselves rather than face capture. Others were taken as slaves. This wasn't a few soldiers losing control. This was thousands, operating with implicit permission because their commanders had given them the city for 24 hours. And here's what makes it even more horrific. The soldiers weren't just random men-at-arms. Knights participated too. Not all of them, maybe not even most of them, but enough that the pattern is undeniable in the historical record. According to court records from medieval cities, women occasionally filed charges after sackings when the occupying forces finally restored order and law. Some of the accused were knights, noble-born, men who'd sworn oaths to protect women. One case from 1378 describes a woman accusing a knight by name of assault during a sacking. She knew his heraldry, recognized his face. The case was dismissed because it had occurred during legitimate military action. Legal, the court ruled. That's what the code of chivalry meant in practice. Protection for some women, none for others. And the difference was simple. Were you on the winning side? Let's talk about what this meant for the women, because they're not abstract. They were real people with names and lives and futures, until an army came and destroyed everything. A girl, maybe 14, living with her family. One day, soldiers break down the door. Her father tries to stop them. He's killed. Her brothers too, if they resist, and then she's dragged into the street, or into another room, or taken to a soldier's camp. What happens next leaves her physically injured if she survives, psychologically destroyed whether she survives or not, and pregnant in many cases. Medieval medical texts occasionally mention this, usually in the context of midwives asking what to do with war babies, children conceived through violence, born to women who had no choice, no agency, no escape. According to church records, these children were often abandoned, left at monasteries, raised in orphanages if they were lucky, or killed by mothers who couldn't bear to look at them. The church called this a sin, but offered no solutions, no support, just judgment. And the trauma didn't end when the soldiers left. In medieval society, a woman's value, her marriageability, her social standing, and her family's honor was tied to her sexual purity, even when that purity was taken by force. Even when she was a victim, she was still considered ruined. According to records from medieval communities, women who'd been assaulted during sackings often faced rejection from their own families. Husbands abandoned wives. Fathers disowned daughters. Communities shunned survivors. Why? Because their presence was a reminder of shame, of defeat, of violation. One heartbreaking letter from 1403, written by a young woman to her aunt, describes being turned away by her family after a sacking. "They say I bring dishonor," she wrote, "but I did nothing. The dishonor was done to me." Her aunt took her in. But most women weren't that fortunate. They were left to survive alone. And a society that offered no support for women without family protection. Many ended up in prostitution, not by choice, but because it was the only option left. The violence didn't just destroy them once. It destroyed them forever. Now let's talk about the soldier's perspective, because understanding how this was justified is crucial to understanding how it was so widespread. According to letters and memoirs from medieval soldiers, there were several common rationalizations. They resisted. This is the price. It's always been done this way. We risked our lives taking this city. We earned this. They're the enemy. They don't count as real people. These weren't psychopaths. Most weren't. They were ordinary men who'd been taught that women on the other side weren't really human, that violence against them wasn't really violence, just war. Medieval military culture reinforced this. Songs celebrated taking women as spoils. Stories glorified it. Even religious texts sometimes framed it as acceptable if the enemy were infidels or heretics. The Fourth Crusade sack of Constantinople in 1204 involved Christian soldiers assaulting Christian women. But they'd been told the Byzantine Christians were schismatics, not true Christians. So it was ... acceptable? The cognitive dissonance is staggering. But that's how atrocity happens. You dehumanize the victims first. And here's what really reveals the system's brutality. Some commanders tried to limit this behavior. Not always, but sometimes. Not out of morality, out of practicality. Sexual violence led to disputes among soldiers, fighting over victims, arguments about who had rights to which women. It disrupted discipline, so some commanders banned it or restricted it, or tried to organize it more efficiently. According to military ordinances from the 5th-10th century, some armies had rules: no assaulting women until the official sacking period began. No taking women claimed by higher-ranking soldiers. No violence that damaged valuable property, i.e., women who could be sold. They weren't trying to protect women. They were trying to manage a resource. That's what women were in medieval military culture. Resources, commodities, not people. Ask yourself, could you have stopped this? You're a knight. You see it happening. You know it's wrong, but you're surrounded by hundreds of soldiers doing the same thing. Your commander gave permission. Your fellow knights are participating. If you intervene, you're breaking ranks, defying custom, possibly accused of cowardice or disloyalty. And for what? You can't save everyone. You can't stop the whole system. So what do? Most knights did nothing. They looked away, told themselves it wasn't their responsibility. Or they participated, told themselves it was acceptable because everyone else was doing it. A very few tried to stop it, and were often unsuccessful. One account from a 14th century sacking describes a knight who tried to protect women in a church. He stationed himself at the door. Other soldiers simply went around him, entered through windows. He saved maybe a dozen women, while hundreds of others were assaulted nearby. He tried, but the system was bigger than one man's conscience. And here's the truly sickening part. Some women were specifically targeted because of who they were. Noble women, wives and daughters of enemy leaders. Assaulting them wasn't just violence. It was symbolic, political. You were showing that their men couldn't protect them, that their status meant nothing, that your victory was complete. According to chronicles from various medieval conflicts, this happened repeatedly, during civil wars, during succession disputes, during any conflict where humiliating the enemy was as important as defeating them. The women's bodies became battlefields, territory to be conquered and claimed, and this was seen as legitimate warfare. One particularly horrific example comes from the Italian city-state wars of the 14th century. A captured city's ruler was forced to watch as his wife and daughters were assaulted by the conquering commander's men. Then he was released, sent home, expected to live with that knowledge. The message: this is what defeat looks like. Not just military defeat, destruction, humiliation so complete it could never be erased. So when you think about medieval warfare, remember, sexual violence wasn't incidental. It was integral. It was a weapon wielded deliberately. A reward is offered systematically. a terror tactic deployed strategically, and knights, those supposed defenders of women, enabled it, participated in it, or at best failed to stop it. The code of chivalry protected some women, the right women, women on your side, women of your class. Everyone else, they were fair game. That's the darkest truth of medieval warfare, and it's one that the songs never mention, the poems ignore. The legends are carefully edited out, because acknowledging it would mean admitting what knights really were. Not heroes, not protectors, just men with swords, and permission to use them on anyone their commanders designated as an enemy, including especially the defenseless women they'd sworn to protect. Now let's talk about what happened when the soldiers finally left, because you might think the horror ended when the sacking period was over, when order was supposedly restored and the army moved on. But here's the brutal reality. For the survivors, the nightmare was just beginning. Picture this. The soldiers are gone. The fires are out. Bodies litter the streets. And you're one of the women who survived. Congratulations. Now what? Here's where it gets even darker, if that's even possible. Medieval society had no framework, none whatsoever, for dealing with survivors of systematic violence. No counseling, no support services, no recognition that these women were victims of war crimes. Instead, they faced something almost as cruel as the violence itself, total abandonment by their own communities. Let's talk about the economics of trauma, because that's really what this became. A woman who'd been assaulted during a sacking wasn't just psychologically destroyed, she was economically destroyed too. In medieval society, a woman's as primary value in the marriage market was her virginity, or her reputation for faithfulness if she was already married. According to legal records from various medieval cities, women who survived sackings often found themselves in impossible situations. If they'd been married before the sack, their husbands frequently refused to take them back. Canon law technically required husbands to forgive wives who'd been forced. But guess what? Most didn't. They claimed the women had cooperated or enjoyed it, or simply disgraced the family name. One particularly heartbreaking case from Florence in 1402 involves a merchant's wife named Caterina. After the city was briefly occupied and sacked, she returned to her husband's house expecting, I don't know, maybe some compassion? Instead, he had the door barred. According to court records, he stated publicly that he would not raise bastards conceived in dishonor. She wasn't pregnant. There were no bastards. But the mere possibility was enough for him to cast her out. And the church, which supposedly valued marriage as a sacred bond, they sided with him. The marriage was annulled because Caterina had been defiled and could no longer fulfill her marital duties with honor. Think about that logic for a second. She was the victim. She had done nothing wrong, and medieval society treated her as if she were the criminal. Its victim blaming has risen to an art form and is codified into law. For unmarried women, the situation was somehow even worse. An unmarried woman's virginity was literally her dowry. her ticket to a respectable marriage and economic security. After a sacking, that was gone, and with it any hope of a normal life. According to records from medieval guilds and craft associations, some women managed to find work after sackings, but usually only in the most desperate occupations. Laundry work if they were lucky, begging if they weren't, and prostitution not by choice, but because it was literally the only option when your family had disowned you, your community had rejected you, and you had no marketable skills in a society that barely allowed women to work at all. The chronicles are full of casual mentions of this. After the sack of city name, many women of previously good reputation were forced into dissolute lives. That's how they phrased it. Forced into dissolute lives, as if the women had chosen this path, as if they had any choice at all. But here's what really gets me. The babies. Remember those war babies I mentioned? The children conceived through violence? Medieval society had no idea what to do with them, so they did what they always did when faced with uncomfortable realities. They blamed the mothers. According to church records from across Europe, foundling hospitals and monasteries were flooded with abandoned infants after major sieges and sackings. Some women left notes with the babies, desperate pleas, explaining that they couldn't care for a child conceived in violence, couldn't look at a face that reminded them daily of the worst moment of their lives. The church called this abandonment a sin. Some moralists even suggested these women should be prosecuted for infanticide if the babies died, which many did, because medieval foundling hospitals had mortality rates above 50%. So the church created a system where women were damned if they kept the babies and damned if they didn't. One Franciscan monk in 14th century Germany wrote a treatise about this, and his solution was breathtaking in its cruelty. He suggested that women who deconceived children through wartime violence should raise them as penance for their participation in sin, their participation, as if being assaulted was something they'd chosen to participate in. And if you think the children themselves had it any better, think again. The ones who survived infancy often grew up marked by their origins. According to legal codes from various medieval kingdoms, children of violence or war bastards had limited legal rights. They couldn't inherit property in most jurisdictions. They couldn't join guilds or enter respectable trades. The sins of their fathers and the trauma of their mothers followed them for life. Now let us talk about something that historians really do and like to discuss, the aftermath for the soldiers themselves. Because creating a military system where systematic atrocity is not just permitted but rewarded doesn't just destroy the victims, it destroys the perpetrators too. Medieval chronicles occasionally mention soldiers who came back from campaigns disturbed in mind or haunted by visions. We'd call it PTSD today. They'd called it various things: divine punishment, demonic possession, humoral imbalance, but they were describing the same phenomenon. According to letters from medieval physicians, soldiers who'd participated in sackings sometimes developed what they called melancholia, depression, night terrors, and inability to readjust to normal life. Some became violent at home. Others withdrew completely. Many turned to alcohol, which medieval society produced in abundance and encouraged as a cure for basically everything. But here's the thing. Medieval society had zero sympathy for these men. You'd think there might be some recognition that asking soldiers to commit atrocities might have psychological consequences, but no. If you came back disturbed, that was your personal failing, your weakness. Probably a sign that you'd committed some private sin, and God was punishing you. The Chronicles describe veterans who couldn't hold jobs, couldn't maintain relationships, who wandered from town to town, living as beggars or bandits. And you know what medieval society's solution was? Nothing. There was no veterans administration, no therapy, and no support system whatsoever. You were on your own. Some turned to the church, seeking forgiveness and peace through penance and prayer. Monastic records show a significant number of men who joined monasteries after military service, often specifically citing the need to atone for deeds done in war. But most monasteries didn't want them. Traumatized veterans made for unstable monks. So you had this whole population of psychologically destroyed men, created by a military system that used them as instruments of terror, then discarded them when they came back damaged. Sound familiar? It should, because we're still doing basically the same thing today, just with better weapons, and slightly less honest about what we're asking soldiers to do. Let me tell you about a specific case that really drives this home. In 1381, an English knight named Thomas Beaumont returned from campaigns in France during the 100 Years' War. According to his family's records, he'd been a normal, well-adjusted young man before he left. He came back unable to sleep, prone to violent outbursts, and haunted by what he'd seen and done. His family tried everything. They consulted physicians who prescribed bloodletting and herbal remedies. They brought in priests who performed exorcisms. Nothing worked. Thomas eventually became so disturbed that his own family had him confined to a tower on their estate. For his own protection and that of others, he lived there for 12 years, essentially imprisoned by his own trauma before dying at age 34. His epitaph, still visible on his tomb, reads, "Here lies Thomas Beaumont, soldier of God and king, whose mind was troubled by visions of war." Even in death, his family couldn't quite admit what had really happened to him. And here's the part that should make you angry. Thomas's story wasn't unique. It was common. Medieval records are full of references to veterans who couldn't readjust, who died young, who ended up in poverty or prison, or dead by their own hand. The system chewed them up and spit them out, just like it did to their victims. But at least the soldiers had chosen to be there, right? At least they'd signed up for military service, even if they didn't fully understand what that would mean. The women and children in conquered cities, they hadn't chosen anything. They were just in the wrong place when an army showed up, and their rulers made the wrong strategic decision. Let's talk about the long-term impacts on the cities themselves, because the damage wasn't just personal, it was civilizational. When you systematically traumatize an entire population, when you destroy the social fabric of a community, the effects ripple out for generations. According to demographic studies of medieval cities, populations that experienced sackings often took decades to recover their pre-siege numbers. And I'm not just talking about people who were killed during the sacking itself. I'm talking about the cascade of effects that followed. Birth rates plummeted after sackings. Makes sense, right? Women who'd been traumatized weren't exactly eager to have children. Marriages that did happen often ended quickly, either through annulment or abandonment. Extended families fractured as blame and shame tore through kinship networks. Economic productivity collapsed, too. A city's economy depended on skilled craftsmen, established trade networks, and social trust. After a sacking, all of that was gone. Craftsmen were dead or had fled. Trade networks were disrupted. And social trust? Forget it. When you've seen your neighbors at their absolute worst, and yes, there was always collaboration, always people who helped the invaders or took advantage of the chaos, you don't just bounce back from that. One fascinating study of Italian city-states in the 14th and 15th centuries found that cities that experienced major sackings showed measurably lower economic output for up to 50 years afterward, compared to similar cities that hadn't been sacked. 50 years. That's 2 generations of stunted economic growth, of reduced opportunity, of compounded trauma. And the psychological impact on communities as a whole? Medieval records hint at what we'd now call collective trauma. Chroniclers describe cities where people were fearful and suspicious, where festivals and celebrations stopped happening, where the basic social life of the community just died. After the sack of Limoges in 1370, remembering the Black Prince's atrocity, the city never fully recovered its former glory. It had been one of the wealthiest cities in southern France. After the sack, it became a backwater. The trauma was so profound that even 2 centuries later, local records still referenced the Troubles as a defining moment in the city's history. But here's what makes this even more tragic. The system kept perpetuating itself, because the children who survived these sackings grew up in traumatized communities, raised by traumatized parents, in economies that couldn't provide opportunities. And when the next war came along, and there was always a next war, those same children often ended up as soldiers themselves, continuing the cycle. It's generational trauma on a civilizational scale, and medieval society had absolutely no tools to break the cycle. No peace and reconciliation commissions, no reparations, and no acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, this system of warfare was destroying everyone involved. Instead, they just kept doing it. Generation after generation, war after war, sacking after sacking, because that's how it had always been done, and because the people in power, the kings and nobles and military commanders, never had to personally face the consequences. You want to know something that really hammers this home? The same nobles who ordered these sackings, who gave their soldiers free rein to commit atrocities, would then commission beautiful illuminated manuscripts, depicting themselves as paragons of chivalry. They'd have poets write songs about their honor and bravery. They'd fund churches and monasteries, supposedly to save their souls. The cognitive dissonance is absolutely staggering. These men genuinely seemed to believe they were good Christians, honorable knights, defenders of civilization, while simultaneously ordering or enabling systematic violence against civilians that would make a modern war criminal blush. And you know what? Their descendants, the historians and chroniclers who wrote the official histories, mostly went along with it. They sanitized the stories, edited out the uncomfortable bits, and gave us the legend of chivalry that we still believe today. That's why this history matters. That's why we need to talk about the parts that make us uncomfortable. Because when we romanticize medieval warfare, when we get all misty-eyed about knights in shining armor, we're actively participating in the cover-up of systematic atrocity. Every time Hollywood makes a movie about noble knights and doesn't show what they actually did in conquered cities, we're letting the lie persist. Every time we teach kids about chivalry without teaching them about sackings, we're sanitizing history in a way that makes future atrocities more likely. Because if we don't learn from history, if we don't face the ugly truth about what humans are capable of, we're doomed to repeat it. And guess what? We are repeating it. The patterns of sexual violence in modern warfare look remarkably similar to medieval sackings. The systematic use of terror against civilians, the dehumanization of the enemy, the rationalization of atrocity. We've just gotten better at hiding it from the cameras, better at pretending to be shocked when it comes to light, better at prosecuting the occasional scapegoat while the system that enables the violence continues unchanged. So when you think about medieval warfare, remember, this isn't just ancient history, it's a warning. A reminder of what happens when we let military culture normalize violence against civilians. When we separate good people from bad people based on which side they re on. When we allow systematic atrocity to be codified into military law and custom. The knights weren't monsters. The soldiers weren't psychopaths. They were ordinary people operating in a system that made atrocity normal, and that should terrify you, because the capacity for that same systematic evil exists in every society, including ours. The real question isn't, how could they do that? It's, what are we doing right now that our descendants will look back on with the same horror? Think about that the next time you see a movie about heroic medieval knights. Behind all that shining armor was a system of organized terror that destroyed countless lives and left psychological scars that lasted for generations. And we turned it into entertainment, into romance, into something to celebrate. That might be the darkest truth of all. How painful was life inside 60 pounds of steel? You do not become a knight and immediately feel powerful. You become a knight, and then you are handed 60 pounds of steel and told to get on a horse. The first real lesson of knighthood is not how to fight, but how to walk, breathe, and not fall over in your own armor. At first, it's chainmail, a shirt of interlocking rings that drapes over your shoulders like an iron tunic. It's not as heavy as it looks, but it clings to you, drags at your limbs, and catches every drop of sweat your body produces beneath it. You wear a padded gambeson, quilted linen stuffed with wool or rags, which smells awful after a single skirmish and worse after a week. But it keeps the mail from grinding against your skin like a cheese grater. According to medieval arming manuals, the gambeson was considered essential, not optional. One 14th century text warns, "He who wears mail without padding will know suffering, and his flesh will speak of his foolishness." Translation: You'll be shredded like cabbage. As warfare evolves, so does your kit. Plate armor begins to replace mail. At first, just a breastplate and greaves, then pauldrons for your shoulders, vambraces for your forearms, sabatons to encase your feet, articulated joints, riveted segments. Each edition is designed to protect without pinching, though they almost always manage to do both. Eventually, you are sheathed in metal from crown to toe, and it's less like wearing clothes and more like being folded into a walking bell. The helmet is the worst. It muffles your hearing, narrows your vision, and steams up with your own breath. In battle, it protects your skull. Outside of battle, it functions mostly to give you a throbbing headache. Some helmets have visors you can lift, which helps with breathing and spitting, though it also makes your face an easier target. Trade-offs are everywhere in armor. Here's the thing, mobility surprisingly is not impossible. You can run, squat, mount a horse, even roll if trained well. But everything takes effort. You are not agile, you are deliberate, and you quickly learn to conserve movement like a man counting his last coins. After all, if your opponent wears nothing heavier than boiled leather, he'll be darting around while you resemble a mobile sculpture of St. George. Picture this. You're sparring on a full plate. Your opponent is in light gear. He circles you, quick as a cat. You swing. He dodges. You swing again. He dodges again. By the third swing, you're panting. By the fifth, you're questioning your life choices. And he's barely broken a sweat. Then there's the maintenance. Every piece must be cleaned, oiled, and inspected. A single rusted rivet can jam a joint. A dented chest plate can buckle under a second blow. Your squire becomes a blacksmith's apprentice overnight, scrubbing and hammering late into the evening. If he forgets a strap or fails to fasten your cuisses correctly, you notice, painfully and immediately. According to household records from the 15th century, armor maintenance consumed hours daily. One knight's ledger shows payments to 3 different armorers in a single year just for repairs, the medieval equivalent of car maintenance. Except your car can also get you killed if the brakes fail. And let's not forget, armor costs a fortune. A full suite of plates could cost the equivalent of a small manor. Most knights couldn't afford it outright. They'd borrowed, inherited, or pieced together mismatched sets over the years. Some wore their grandfather's breastplate with a cousin's gauntlets and a borrowed helm that didn't quite fit. Fashion, secondary, function, questionable, but it was better than nothing. Let's talk about what it actually feels like to wear armor all day. The weight is distributed across your body. Yes, but that doesn't mean it's comfortable. Imagine carrying a heavy backpack. Now imagine that backpack covers your entire body, presses on your shoulders, digs into your hips, and makes every movement a negotiation. That's armor, and you're expected to wear it for hours, sometimes all day, sometimes while marching, sometimes while fighting. Your shoulders ache within an hour. Your lower back starts screaming by hour 2. By hour 3, you'd sell your soul for 5 minutes without metal pressing into your collarbones. But you can't take it off. Not in enemy territory. Not during a siege. Not when your lord might call for you at any moment. So you endure. Now let's talk about heat. Summer in a full suite of plates is like walking inside a forge. The sun beats down, the metal heats up, and you're essentially cooking inside your own armor. You sweat buckets, literally. By the end of a hot day, you can pour sweat out of your gauntlets like emptying a cup. According to accounts from the Crusades, where European knights fought in the scorching Middle Eastern heat, dehydration was a constant threat. Knights fainted. Some died, not from combat, but from heat stroke. One chronicler described a knight who removed his helm after a march and steam rose from his head like a kettle. Not an exaggeration. Just medieval air conditioning. And in winter, it's just as bad. Cold metal against your skin feels like touching ice. Even with a gambeson, the chill seeps through. Your fingers go numb inside your gauntlets. Your toes freeze inside your sabatons. And if you're riding, the wind cuts through every gap in your armor like a knife. Some knights stuffed extra cloth into their armor for insulation. Others just suffered. One winter campaign record from 1356 notes that several knights developed frostbite on their fingers, despite wearing gloves because the metal gauntlets conducted cold so efficiently. The medieval equivalent of holding an ice cube for 6 hours straight. Ask yourself, could you have handled that? The heat in summer, the cold in winter, and no escape from either? Then there's the issue of, let's call it personal needs. You're sealed in metal, head to toe. And nature, as they say, calls. Going to the bathroom in full armor is a logistical nightmare. Some pieces can be removed quickly, others not so much. You need help, your squire's help, which means your most private moments become a team effort. It's not dignified. It's not pleasant, but it's necessary. Medieval soldiers developed strategies. Drink less during the day. Go before donning armor. And if all else fails, just deal with it. Chronicles from long sieges mention knights who simply relieved themselves in their armor rather than waste time removing it. Gross? Absolutely. Practical? Unfortunately, yes. Let's talk about injuries caused by the armor itself. You'd think the armor would only protect you, but it can hurt you too. Straps dig into your shoulders, leaving deep grooves in your skin. Buckles pinch, edges chafe. And if a piece doesn't fit quite right, it rubs the same spot over and over until you're bleeding. Medieval medical texts describe armor wounds, blisters, cuts, and sores caused not by combat, but by the equipment itself. One 15th century surgeon's manual recommends applying salve to the places where the iron bites. A poetic way of saying your armor is eating you alive. And if you take a hit, the armor doesn't just absorb the blow. It transfers the force into your body. A mace strike might not penetrate your breastplate, but it'll crack your ribs underneath. An arrow might not pierce your helm, but it'll give you a concussion from the impact. According to battlefield records, many knights died not from wounds that broke through their armor, but from internal injuries caused by blunt force trauma. The armor saved them from being stabbed, but it couldn't save them from being crushed. And here's what really gets brutal. If you fall, getting back up is hard. The armor is heavy. The ground is uneven. And if you're in mud, snow, or blood-slicked grass, you're essentially a beetle on its back. You flail. You struggle. You pray someone helps you up before an enemy sees you. Because a knight on the ground is a target, a slow, helpless, extremely valuable target. Many knights were captured simply because they couldn't stand up fast enough. Others were killed where they lay, stabbed through gaps in their armor while they struggled to rise. One account from the Battle of Agincourt describes French knights drowning in mud. Not because the mud was deep, but because they couldn't get up once they fell. Their armor, designed to protect them, became their coffin. Then there's the psychological weight. Yes, the armor is heavy physically, but it's heavy mentally too. Every time you put it on, you're preparing for violence, for pain, for the possibility of death. The ritual of arming piece by piece, strap by strap, becomes a meditation on mortality. You think about the last time you wore it. Who did you fight? Who didn't come home? Some knights developed a kind of reverence for their armor. It had saved them, after all. They cleaned it carefully, repaired it tenderly, spoke to it even. Others grew to hate it. A constant reminder of the life they'd chosen, the weight they'd carry until they died. Medieval poetry occasionally touches on this. One 14th century verse describes a knight removing his armor and feeling lighter in body, but no less burdened in soul, because the armor might come off, but the memories don't. And let's not forget, armor is loud. Every step clanks, every movement jingles. You can't sneak anywhere. Forget ambushes. Forget quiet reconnaissance. When you're in full plate, everyone within 100 yards knows you're coming. It's like wearing a suit made of bells. Some knights tried to muffle their armor with cloth wrappings. Others just accepted it. After all, stealth wasn't the point. Intimidation was. The sound of armored knights approaching was meant to terrify. And it did. But it also meant you could never truly rest. Even when you were trying to sleep, the armor shifted and clinked with every breath. Some knights slept in partial armor, breastplate, and greaves, at a minimum, just in case of a night attack, which meant they never really slept well. Just a series of uncomfortable metal-clad naps. So here's the truth. Life in armor was painful. Physically, mentally, and emotionally. It protected you, yes, but it also confined you, exhausted you, hurt you, and you wore it anyway. because the alternative was worse, because without it you were just flesh, vulnerable, mortal. With it you were a knight, armored, enduring, and endurance, it turns out, was the whole point. You've learned to walk in it. You've learned to fight in it. You've even learned to sleep poorly in it. But here's what the songs never mention. Armor doesn't just protect you from your enemies. Sometimes it feels like it's trying to kill you itself. Let's talk about what happens when things go wrong. You're in battle, adrenaline pumping, chaos everywhere, and suddenly you take a hit not to your body, but to your armor. A mace strike dents your breastplate inward. Now, instead of a smooth curve protecting your ribs, you have a sharp metal crease digging into your chest with every breath. You can't stop to fix it. You can't remove it. You just have to keep fighting while your own armor slowly bruises you from the inside. Or maybe a sword catches the edge of your pauldron and jams the articulation. Now your shoulder won't rotate properly. Your sword arm is compromised, and the enemy has noticed. According to battlefield accounts from the 15th century, damaged armor killed knights almost as often as enemy weapons did. One French chronicle describes a knight whose dented helm pressed against his skull until he collapsed from the pressure, hours after the blow that caused it. His armor didn't fail him. It just failed slowly. Then there's the horror of being trapped. Imagine this. You fall during battle, hard, and when you try to get up, you realize a buckle has caught on something, or a strap has tangled, or the dented plate is now pinning your arm against your side. You're stuck on the ground, in full armor, surrounded by enemies. Panic sets in. You thrash. You pull. But the more you struggle, the worse it gets. This is how knights died. Not from lack of skill or courage, but from mechanical failure at the worst possible moment. Medieval military manuals actually include instructions for squires on how to quickly disassemble armor on a fallen knight, because sometimes the only way to save him was to cut him out of his own protection. The armor that took an hour to put on had to come off in seconds, or he'd die wearing it. Picture this. You're on your back. A strap is caught. Your squire is frantically trying to cut you free while arrows rain down around you both. Every second feels like an hour. Every breath might be your last. And all you can think is, I survived the blade. Please don't let the buckle kill me. Let's talk about what armor does to your body over time. You're carrying 60 to 80 pounds of metal every day. For years, your spine compresses. Your shoulders round forward from the constant weight. Your knees and hips wear down from the stress. By your 30s, you move like a man in his 50s. By your 40s, you can barely mount a horse without help. According to skeletal analyses of medieval knights, yes, archaeologists have studied their bones, and many show signs of severe arthritis, spinal damage, and joint deterioration. Some had compression fractures in their vertebrae just from wearing armor repeatedly, the medieval equivalent of occupational hazards, except there was no workers' comp, just pain. One English, Knight's will from 1403 mentions that he could no longer bear the weight of full harness and had to retire from active service at age 42. He lived another 20 years in constant pain because his body had been destroyed by the very thing meant to protect it. And here's what really gets me. The scars armor leaves aren't always visible. There are the grooves in your shoulders where the straps dig in, the calluses on your hips where the cuirass rests, the permanent dent in your collarbones from years of supporting weight. You develop a distinctive walk, a forward lean, tight shoulders, and careful steps. Other knights recognize it immediately. It's the walk of someone whose body has been reshaped by metal. And even when you take the armor off, you still feel it. Phantom weight pressing down. Your muscle memory is expecting the resistance that's no longer there. Some knights reported feeling naked without armor, not because they felt vulnerable, but because they'd worn it so long it felt like part of their body. Medieval physicians referred to it as armor sickness, a condition in which the body became so accustomed to wearing metal that removing it caused dizziness, imbalance, and anxiety. You weren't just wearing armor, you were becoming it. Now let's talk about something nobody mentions. The smell. You sweat in armor, a lot, and that sweat has nowhere to go. It soaks into the gambeson, which never fully dries between uses. It pools in the creases of the plate. It ferments. After a week on campaign, you smell like a stable fire mixed with desperation, and you can't escape it. The smell is trapped inside the armor with you. Every breath you take through that narrow helm slit, you're breathing your own funk. According to accounts from medieval campaigns, the smell inside a war camp was so bad that commanders had to position tents downwind of the armored knights. One chronicler described it as the stench of iron and rot, as if death himself had taken up metalworking. Poetic, accurate, horrifying. Ask yourself, could you have handled living in your own filth for weeks at a time, with no way to properly clean yourself or your equipment? And in battle, it gets worse. Blood splashes onto your armor, mud cakes into every joint, bits of other things get stuck in the articulations. After a fight, cleaning your armor isn't just maintenance. It's a moral imperative. Your squire scrubs for hours. Vinegar and sand to remove rust. Oil to protect the metal. Prayers to remove the memories. But some stains never come out. Not from the armor, not from your mind. Medieval armor often bore the marks of previous battles, dents, scratches, and discoloration. Some knights wore these scars proudly, proof of survival. Others had them repaired immediately. They didn't want to remember. One account from a 14th century armorer's workshop describes a knight who demanded every single mark be removed from his plate, even the ones that didn't affect function. He could not bear to see them, the armorer wrote, each dent a ghost he wished to forget. Let's talk about injuries you get just from wearing armor. Blisters from friction, raw skin where buckles rub, pressure sores from long hours in the saddle while encased in metal. One particularly nasty issue, mail burn. When chain mail is struck hard, the rings don't always break. Sometimes they just compress, driving into your skin like tiny metal teeth. Even with a gambeson underneath, a hard enough blow can leave a pattern of circular wounds across your flesh, like you've been bitten by a mechanical snake. Medieval medical texts describe treating these wounds with salves, bandages, and prayers. They often became infected. An infection in the medieval world could kill you just as surely as a sword. According to one 13th century surgeon's account, he treated a knight whose entire shoulder had become infected from mail burn after a tournament. The knight survived but lost use of his arm. His armor had protected him from being skewered, but it had also destroyed him. And here's the thing about pain. You can't show it. You're a knight. Knights don't complain. Knights don't wince. Knights don't admit that their bodies are screaming with every step. So you smile, you nod. You tell your squire you're fine as he helps you out of armor that leaves bloody grooves in your skin. You drink to numb the pain. You pray for strength. And you put the armor back on the next day. Because what's the alternative? Admit weakness? Retire? Let everyone see that you're not invincible? No, you endure. Quietly, desperately. Medieval letters between knights occasionally reveal the truth. One letter from 1387 describes a knight writing to a friend, "My body rebels against the iron, but to admit it would be to surrender my name." So he kept wearing it, until his body finally gave out. Then there's what armor does to you mentally. Every time you put it on, you're preparing to be hurt, to hurt others, to possibly die. The ritual of arming becomes a kind of psychological armor, too. Each strap buckled is a wall built between you and your fear. But walls work both ways. They keep fear out, and they keep you trapped inside. Some knights developed ritual prayers, gestures, and specific orders for donning each piece. These weren't just superstitions. They were coping mechanisms. Control the process, control the fear, but you never fully control it. The fear is always there, sealed inside the armor with you. And when you take the armor off at night, exhausted and aching, the fear doesn't leave. It just finds new places to hide. Let's talk about what happens when you can't get the armor off fast enough. You're wounded, badly, and you need treatment immediately. But first, someone has to remove 60 pounds of metal carefully, so they don't make the injury worse. Straps have to be cut, buckles pried loose, plates lifted away from wounds. Meanwhile, you're bleeding, fading, praying that your squire's hands are steady and fast. Medieval battlefield surgeons developed techniques for emergency armor removal. But even with skill and speed, the process took precious minutes. One account from the Battle of Crecy describes a knight who bled to death while his companions tried desperately to remove his armor. The wound was survivable, but by the time they got to it, it was too late. His armor had protected him from the blade, but it had also prevented anyone from saving him. And here's what nobody prepares you for. Sometimes the armor doesn't come off at all. Knights killed in battle were often left in their armor because removing it was too difficult, too time-consuming, or simply too horrifying. Mass graves from medieval battles contain bodies still in full plate, rusted, corroded, fused with the remains inside. The armor that defined them in life became their tomb in death. Archaeological excavations reveal the grim reality. Some knights died in positions that suggest they were trapped, unable to move, while the battle raged around them. Their final moments were spent not fighting, but struggling against their own equipment. One excavation from the Battle of Toten in 1461 uncovered a knight whose breastplate had been so badly damaged that it collapsed inward, pinning him. He likely couldn't breathe, couldn't move, and died slowly while the battle continued overhead. His armor didn't fail to protect him. It just protected him to death. So here's the brutal truth about life in armor. It saved you, but it also broke you. It made you powerful, but it also made you vulnerable in new ways. It defined who you were, but it also confined who you could be. Every day you wore, it was a negotiation between protection and pain, between strength and suffering. And you never won that negotiation. You just survived it. One agonizing day at a time, but you wore it anyway, because without armor, you weren't a knight. You were just a man with a sword. And in the medieval world, that wasn't enough. So you buckled the straps, tightened the buckles, lowered the visor. You ignored the ache in your shoulders, the pressure on your spine, the way your body screamed with every movement. You carried the weight, because that's what knights did. And if it killed you slowly from the inside out, one vertebra at a time, well, that was just the cost of wearing the title. Some knights found ways to cope. They commissioned lighter armor. They took breaks when they could. They trained their bodies to adapt. Others just pushed through. Stubbornness and pride an equal measure. And a few broke under the weight, literally or figuratively. Medieval records mention knights who retired due to weakness of the flesh, a polite code for bodies that simply couldn't take it anymore. They weren't cowards. They weren't failures. They were just human beings who'd spent decades carrying something humans weren't meant to carry. You learn to read your body's warnings. The twinge in your knee means rain is coming. The sharp pain in your shoulder means you've pushed too hard. The numbness in your fingers means the cold is winning. You become a walking medical chart. Every scar, every ache tells a story. And you share these stories with other knights quietly over drinks when no one else is listening. My left hip hasn't been right since Verneuil. This shoulder clicks every time I raise my sword. Been that way for 3 years. Sometimes my hands shake. I don't know why. These conversations are secret. Confessions of vulnerability in a world that demands strength. But they're also bonds. Proof that you're not alone in your suffering. And then one day you realize you can't do this anymore. Maybe it's a morning when you can't get out of bed without help. Maybe it's a training session where your body simply refuses to obey. Or maybe it's just a quiet, terrible knowledge that the next time you wear armor into battle, you might not come back. Not because you're not skilled, but because your body can't protect you anymore. That's when you know the armor has won. You've carried it for years, decades even, and now it's carried you to the end. Some knights accepted this gracefully. They passed their armor to a son or squire. They retired to quieter lives. Others raged against it. They kept fighting, kept riding, kept pretending they were still the warriors they'd once been, until their bodies decided for them. So when you think of medieval knights, don't just picture the shining armor. Picture what it cost to wear it, the pain, the exhaustion, the slow destruction of the body that carried it. Picture a man who could barely walk without limping, smiling as he rode past cheering crowds. Picture hands that shook from nerve damage, still gripping a sword with practiced ease. Picture a spine compressed by decades of weight, still standing straight in a ceremony. That was life in 60 pounds of steel. Not glory, not comfort, just endurance. And the knights who survived it, they didn't survive because the armor protected them. They survived because they were tougher than the steel they wore. Battlefield gore, rape, and burning villages. You were told that war was glorious. Those knights were noble defenders of the weak, protectors of honor, champions of the righteous. And then you rode into your first village after a siege, saw what your comrades had done, and realized the songs lied about everything. War isn't glorious. It's horror with banners. And being a knight doesn't make you a hero. It makes you complicit. Let's be absolutely clear about what we're discussing. This isn't the sanitized version you see in movies. This isn't the romantic vision painted by medieval chroniclers trying to please their noble patrons. This is the brutal reality that most historical accounts gloss over or hide behind euphemisms. Because what happened on medieval battlefields and in conquered towns wasn't just combat. It was carnage, cruelty, and crimes that would be prosecuted as war crimes today. And knights, those supposed paragons of chivalry, were often the ones leading it. According to contemporary accounts that weren't written for courtly audiences, the aftermath of medieval battles and sieges involved systematic violence against civilians that was accepted, expected, and sometimes even encouraged. We're going to talk about it, not to glorify it, but because understanding the reality is the only way to understand what being a knight actually meant. So let's start with the battlefield itself. The songs talk about heroic duels and noble charges. They don't mention what happens after. When the fighting stops and the dying begins, you're standing in a field. Around you are hundreds, maybe thousands of bodies. Some are dead. Many aren't. The wounded cry out. They beg for help, for water, for mercy. And what happens next depends entirely on whether they're worth ransoming. If they're knights, noblemen, or anyone with money, you help them. You bind their wounds. You treat them carefully because they're valuable. If they're common soldiers, peasants pressed into service, men with nothing to offer, you leave them, or finish them. According to battlefield accounts from the 100 Years' War, it was standard practice to execute wounded enemy soldiers who couldn't be ransomed. not out of cruelty, though that existed, but out of practicality. Wounded men were a liability. They required resources. They might recover and fight again. Better to end it quickly. But quickly is generous, because on medieval battlefields, death was rarely swift. You've got men with gut wounds that will take hours or days to kill. Men with shattered limbs are screaming as infection sets in. Men whose faces have been caved in by mace blows, still somehow alive, and there's no morphine, no anesthesia, no real understanding of shock or internal bleeding. Just pain, raw, endless pain. Some commanders ordered their men to finish the wounded, both enemy and their own. It was considered a mercy. But mercy killings on a battlefield aren't clean. They're not gentle. They're a dagger between the ribs, a sword through the throat, a boot on the neck until the struggling stops. Picture this. You're walking through the aftermath. Your boots stick in the mud, except it's not mud. It's blood mixed with churned earth. You step over a boy, maybe 16, clutching his intestines. He's crying for his mother. You keep walking, because what else can you do? Then there are the scavengers. The moment a battle ends, they descend. Not just crows and dogs, though there are plenty of those, but people, camp followers, local peasants, professional looters. They strip the dead and dying. Armor, weapons, coins, boots, rings, teeth, anything valuable. And they don't always wait for the dying to finish dying. Medieval court records document multiple cases of wounded soldiers being robbed and often killed by scavengers before any official help could arrive. One account from the Battle of Agincourt describes wounded knights being stripped to the skin while yet drawing breath, their pleas for mercy drowned by the screams of others in like circumstance. War creates its own economy, and on the battlefield, the dead are currency. But here's what really reveals the horror. Sometimes the worst violence isn't during the battle. It's after, when the enemy has surrendered, when resistance has ended. When should the killing stop? It doesn't, because medieval warfare operated on a principle that most people today find horrifying. A city or castle that resisted and was taken by force had no rights. None. If you surrendered immediately when besieged, you might be treated with relative mercy, stripped of valuables, maybe imprisoned, but alive. But if you made the attackers fight for it, if you killed their men, cost them time and resources, then what followed was called sacking, and sacking meant everything. Let's talk about what sacking a city actually meant. The term sounds almost administrative, clinical. It's not. Sacking was systematic destruction with no rules and minimal restraint. When a medieval army breached a city's walls or forced to surrender after resistance, the soldiers were often permitted to plunder for a set period, usually 24 to 48 hours. During that time, they could take whatever they wanted, do whatever they wanted, and they did. According to chronicles from the Crusades, the sack of Jerusalem in 1099 resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians, men, women, and children. They were massacred in the streets, in their homes, in mosques and synagogues, where they'd sought sanctuary. One eyewitness described soldiers wading in blood up to their ankles. This wasn't an exception. This was standard procedure. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 by Crusaders. Christian soldiers sacking a Christian city involved 3 days of murder, rape, and looting. Priceless religious artifacts were melted down for gold. Libraries were burned. Women and children were not spared. Even the chroniclers, writing for noble audiences, couldn't hide the horror, and this happened everywhere. During the 100 Years' War, French and English armies sacked each other's towns repeatedly. During the Reconquista, Christian and Muslim armies both sacked cities without mercy. In Italy, the constant warfare between city-states meant sacking was practically routine. It wasn't an aberration, it was policy, and knights, those noble warriors, were leading it. According to military historians, the logic was brutal but clear. Resistance had to be punished. Otherwise, every city would fight to the last man, making warfare impossibly costly. So you made an example. You showed what happened when people resisted. You destroyed them so completely that the next city would surrender immediately. Terror as strategy. Let's talk about what happened to the people. When your city is sacked, you don't die heroically in battle. You die in your home, or in the street, or hiding in a cellar that becomes your tomb. Men are killed usually quickly if they're lucky. Soldiers don't waste time, but women, children, the elderly, they're where it gets worse. Because a sacked city isn't just about taking valuables. It's about domination, humiliation, breaking the spirit of the conquered. And throughout history, that has meant sexual violence on a mass scale. Medieval chronicles, even the sanitized ones, occasionally mention what they call outrages against women during sackings. That's a euphemism. What they're describing is systematic rape. According to accounts from multiple medieval conflicts, when a city fell, women were considered part of the spoils. Soldiers weren't just permitted to assault them. It was expected. Some commanders tried to limit this not out of morality, but to maintain discipline. Rape could lead to infighting among soldiers arguing over victims, but enforcement was minimal, and many commanders simply didn't care. One particularly horrific account from the sack of Limoges in 1370 describes how the city, which had rebelled against English rule, was destroyed on the orders of Edward the Black Prince, one of the most celebrated knights of his era. The chronicler Froissart, who usually glorified noble deeds, wrote that men, women, and children were put to the sword, and described acts of violence so brutal he struggled to record them. This wasn't a barbarian horde. This was a Christian army led by a paragon of chivalry. Ask yourself, how do you reconcile that? How do you square the ideal of knighthood with the reality of what knights actually did? And children weren't spared. Medieval warfare didn't distinguish between combatants and civilians, between adults and children. If you resisted, everyone paid the price. Chronicles from the period document children being killed during sackings, sometimes deliberately, sometimes as collateral. sometimes simply because soldiers didn't care to check who they were striking. Some were taken as slaves. Some were left orphaned among the ruins. The lucky ones died quickly. According to records from medieval slave markets, children captured during sackings were valuable commodities. They could be raised as servants, laborers, or sold to households that needed workers. War created supply. Markets created demand. And medieval society saw nothing wrong with profiting from both. Then there were the fires, because sacking wasn't just about killing and looting. It was about erasing. Once the soldiers had taken everything valuable, they burned what remained. Houses, churches, granaries, entire neighborhoods reduced to ash. Sometimes this was a strategic destruction of resources the enemy might use, but often it was just destruction for its own sake, making sure the city could never recover, ensuring the message was clear. This is what happens when you resist. Medieval cities, built primarily of wood, burned easily, and fires spread quickly. Accounts from various sackings describe cities burning for days. The smoke is visible for miles. The smell of burning flesh mixed with timber and thatch, and if people were trapped inside, if they couldn't escape, that was their problem. So here's the reality you faced as a knight. You weren't just a warrior. You were an enforcer of terror. You didn't just fight battles. You participated in or witnessed or enabled atrocities that would haunt you forever. And the worst part? It was legal, accepted, expected. The code of chivalry said you should protect the weak. But when your lord ordered you to sack a city, you did it. Because disobedience was treason. And if you hesitated, if you showed mercy when you weren't supposed to, you were weak, soft, unreliable, so you did what was required. You followed orders. You participated. And then you lived with what you'd done. You participated. You witnessed. And even if you didn't personally commit the worst acts, you were there. You wore the armor. You carried the banner. You were part of the machine. And now you have to live with that. Let's talk about what happens after a sacking. The soldiers leave. They march to the next campaign, pockets full of plunder, songs on their lips. Behind them they leave ruins. Not just physical ruins, though the burned buildings and broken walls are real enough, but human ruins. People whose lives have been destroyed so completely that survival barely seems worth the effort. According to chronicles from cities that were sacked and later rebuilt, the population often never recovered. Disease swept through the survivors, starvation followed, and those who could flee did. One account from a French town sacked in 1421 notes that of the original 4,000 inhabitants, fewer than 300 remained a year later. The rest were dead, enslaved, or scattered. That's what conquest looked like. Not glory, depopulation. And here's the part nobody talks about. The trauma didn't end when the soldiers left. Women who survived sexual assault often faced rejection from their own communities. In medieval society, a woman's honor was tied to her chastity, even if it was taken by force. Some were abandoned by their husbands. Others were blamed for what had happened to them. According to medieval church records, women who became pregnant from rape during wartime faced impossible choices. Keep the child and be marked forever, attempt termination and risk death or excommunication. There were no good options. One heartbreaking case from 1347 describes a woman seeking the church's guidance after a sacking. She'd been assaulted by soldiers and was now pregnant. The priest's recorded response: "The child must be born, for all life is God's creation. Your suffering is a test of faith. No support, no justice. Just more suffering wrapped in theology." Children who survived sackings grew up with trauma that shaped their entire lives. Many witnessed their parents being killed. Their homes were destroyed. Their entire world turned to ash in a matter of hours. Medieval sources don't use words like trauma or PTSD, but the effects are visible in the records. Orphanages in cities near conflict zones were chronically overcrowded. Monasteries took in children who'd stopped speaking after witnessing atrocities. One chronicle from a monastery in northern France describes taking in a boy who'd survived a sacking at age 6. He never spoke again. He flinched at loud noises for the rest of his life. He lived to adulthood in the monastery, but according to the monks, the light had gone from his eyes, as if his soul had departed though his body remained. War doesn't just kill people. It kills futures, and here's where it gets even darker. Some knights rationalized what they'd done. They had to, because the alternative, accepting that they'd participated in monstrous acts, was unbearable. So they created justifications. They resisted. They brought it on themselves. It's the price of war. Always has been. We were following orders. What choice did we have? They would have done the same to us. According to letters and confessions from medieval knights, these rationalizations appear repeatedly. One letter from 1378, written by an English knight to his brother, describes participating in a sacking and then adds, "It is an ugly business, but necessary. A city that resists must be taught. Otherwise all would fight to the last stone. He's not defending it as good, just as necessary." It's the logic of someone trying to sleep at night. Some knights turned to religion. They confessed obsessively, made pilgrimages, donated to churches, funded masses for the souls of those they'd killed. Not all of them, maybe not even most, but enough that the pattern is visible in medieval records. One particularly striking case involves a French knight named Guy de Montfort, who participated in multiple sackings during the 13th century. Later in life, according to chronicles, he became increasingly devout. He gave away much of his wealth to the church. He wore a hair shirt under his clothing as penance. He was trying to buy forgiveness. From God, maybe, but more likely from himself. According to his confessor's notes, yes, some of these survived. Guy struggled with nightmares until his death. Dreams of burning cities, of faces he couldn't forget. The church absolved him. His conscience never did. But not all knights felt guilt. Some became hardened, desensitized. They'd seen so much horror that it stopped affecting them. They became efficient, professional, they could participate in atrocities and then sit down to dinner without missing a beat. Medieval chroniclers sometimes noted this with a kind of horrified fascination. One account describes a knight who'd sacked so many towns he spoke of burning homes as a farmer speaks of plowing fields with neither passion nor remorse, merely as work to be done. That's what happens when violence becomes routine. It stops being shocking. It becomes your job. And maybe that's worse than guilt, because guilt at least means you still feel something. Ask yourself, which would you have become? The knight tortured by what he'd done, or the one who simply stopped caring? Let's talk about the commanders who ordered these things, because individual knights might follow orders, but someone gave those orders: kings, lords, celebrated military leaders whose names are still taught in history classes. Edward the Black Prince, remember him, paragon of chivalry? He ordered the sack of Limoges that killed thousands of civilians. King John of England authorized multiple brutal suppressions of rebellious towns during his reign. Richard the Lionheart, that romantic crusader hero, personally ordered the execution of nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners at Acre in 1191, not combatants, prisoners who'd already surrendered. According to Muslim chronicles of the event, they were marched out in groups and systematically killed. It took hours. Richard watched. Then he went to dinner. These weren't aberrations. These were calculated decisions by celebrated leaders, and history remembers them as heroes. Here's what really gets me. The same society that idealized chivalry, that wrote elaborate rules about honor and courtesy, which celebrated knights as protectors of the weak, that same society accepted and even expected that those knights would commit atrocities when ordered. There was no cognitive dissonance, no contradiction, because the code of chivalry only applied to certain people. Noble prisoners were treated with respect. Peasants were expendable. Enemy civilians weren't even people. They were obstacles or resources. According to medieval legal codes, crimes committed during warfare were simply not crimes. Killing, assault, theft, all legal if done by soldiers against an enemy population. The law itself made atrocity permissible. One legal text from 14th century France explicitly states that soldiers operating under a lord's command cannot be prosecuted for acts committed during a siege or sacking. It wasn't a loophole, it was policy. So what about the knights who refused? The ones who said, "No, I won't do this." They existed. Rarely, but they existed, and they paid for it. Medieval records document a few cases of knights who refused orders to participate in sackings or execute prisoners. Some were dismissed from service. Others were accused of cowardice or disloyalty. A few were executed for disobedience. One account from the 1340s describes a knight who refused to participate in burning a village. His commander gave him a choice: follow orders or be tried for treason. He chose treason. According to the record, he was stripped of his title and lands. His family was disgraced, and he spent his remaining years in poverty. He made the moral choice, and it destroyed him. So when you ask, Why didn't knights refuse? That's why. Because refusing meant losing everything. Your honor, your livelihood, your future. And most people aren't strong enough to sacrifice everything for principle. And here's the cruelest irony. The same knights who participated in sackings would then return home and attend church. They'd kneel before altars, take communion, pray for forgiveness. And the church, which preached peace and mercy and love, would absolve them. Because the church needed those knights, needed their protection, needed their donations. So they created theological frameworks that made the violence acceptable. Just war theory, the idea that violence committed in the service of a righteous cause wasn't sin, it was duty. Killed civilians during a crusade? That's fine, they were infidels. Sacked a rebellious town? Necessary to maintain order. Burned villages to deny resources to the enemy? Strategic, not sinful. According to medieval theological texts, violence committed under proper authority, for proper reasons, wasn't murder. It was justice. The church justified. Knights provided the force. And everyone pretended the blood wasn't on both their hands. Let's talk about what this meant for you personally, because you're not just reading about this. In our narrative, you're living it. You've participated in things you can't undo and seen things you can't use. Maybe you personally killed civilians. Perhaps you just stood by while others did. Either way, you're complicit. And now you have to carry that. For the rest of your life, some nights you wake up hearing screams. Not from nightmares, from memory. You see faces. A woman clutching a child. An old man begging for mercy. A burning building with people still inside. You tell yourself you had no choice. You were following orders. It was war. But deep down, you could have refused. You could have walked away. You didn't. And now you live with that. According to medieval confession records, this guilt was real and pervasive. Priests heard confessions from knights who couldn't move past what they'd done. Some sought penance through extreme axe flagellation, prolonged fasting, and pilgrimages to dangerous locations. They were trying to punish themselves, to balance the scales somehow. But no penance brings back the dead, no absolution that erases memory. One confession from 1403 records a knight saying, "I confess to the burning of homes, the killing of those who begged for mercy, and acts of violence against women, which I cannot bring myself to name. I know God may forgive me, but I cannot forgive myself." The priest offered the standard response: pray, repent, trust in God's mercy. It didn't help. And here's the final terrible truth. Most of medieval society didn't see these acts as atrocities. They saw them as normal, regrettable, maybe, but normal. War was brutal, always had been. Civilians suffered. That was just how it worked. The songs didn't mention it because it wasn't heroic. The chronicles downplayed it because it wasn't noble. But everyone knew it happened, and most accepted it as the cost of maintaining power. Only a very few questioned whether it had to be this way, and they were dismissed as naive, idealistic, dangerously soft. because in the medieval world, showing mercy to your enemies was seen as weakness, and weakness got you killed. So the cycle continued, generation after generation, war after war. Knights swore oaths to protect the innocent, then participated in their destruction, and everyone pretended not to notice the contradiction. So when you think about medieval knights, remember this: they weren't just warriors. They were instruments of terror. The same men who wrote poetry about honor participated in war crimes. The same code that praised protecting women enabled their systematic assault. The same society that celebrated chivalry enabled atrocity. This is the truth beneath the armor, the reality behind the legend. And it's why, centuries later, we're still trying to reconcile the ideal of the knight with what knights actually did. Because the gap between the two isn't just wide. It's a chasm filled with bodies and screams and ruins that never fully healed. That was medieval warfare, not glorious, not noble, not honorable, just brutal and unforgivable. And you, in our story, were part of it, whether you wanted to be or not. Wife and children destroyed, money gone. You survived the training. You earned the title. You wore the armor. And then you came home to discover that being a knight doesn't just destroy you on the battlefield. It destroys everything you were supposed to be protecting. Your family, your wealth, your future. Because here's what the songs never tell you. While you were off fighting for honor and glory, your life back home was falling apart. And there was nothing you could do to stop it. Let's start with the simple truth. Being a knight meant being absent, not for days or weeks, for months, sometimes years. Campaigns lasted seasons. Sieges dragged on indefinitely. And when one war ended, your lord often called you to another. You didn't get to say no. You didn't get to negotiate. Your feudal obligations required you to serve typically 40 days per year minimum, but in practice, much longer. According to military service records from the 14th century, some knights spent more time on campaign than at home. One English knight's household accounts show he was absent for 8 out of 12 months in 1346. 8 months. 2/3 of the year. Now, picture what that does to a family. Your wife barely knows you. You married young, probably in your early 20s, maybe even as a teenager. The marriage was arranged. Political, economic. You didn't choose her. She didn't choose you. And before you could even begin to build something resembling a partnership, you left. Off to war. Off to tournaments. Off to serve your lord. She was left behind to manage everything. The estate. The servants. The children. The accounts. All the responsibilities with none of the authority, because you're still the lord of the manor. Even when you're not there, even when you haven't been home in months. According to letters between medieval noblewomen, this absence created enormous strain. One letter from 1388, written by a lady to her sister, describes her husband. He returns a stranger. We speak, but do not know each other. The children ask who the man in armor is. They were married for 12 years, and they were strangers. Picture this. You come home after 6 months on campaign, exhausted, traumatized, changed. Your wife greets you formally. There's no warmth, no real connection. She's been managing alone, making decisions alone, surviving alone. And now you're back, expecting to resume your role as head of household, even though you have no idea what's been happening. The estate's finances? She handled them. Disputes with neighbors? She settled them. Your children's education? She arranged it. You were gone. She did everything. And now you're back, and you expect ... what? Gratitude. Obedience? Love? She's resentful, exhausted. And honestly, she's learned she doesn't need you. At least, not the way medieval marriage was supposed to work. Let's talk about what this did to medieval marriages. According to court records, yes, there were medieval divorce proceedings, though they were rare and required church annulment. Absence was a common complaint. Women petitioned for separation because their husbands had abandoned them. Not technically, they hadn't run away, but functionally they'd been gone for years. One case from 1377 describes a knight who'd been absent for 4 consecutive years on various campaigns. His wife petitioned the church for annulment, arguing that the marriage existed in name only, for he is never present to fulfill his duties as husband. The church denied her petition because he was serving his Lord, and that trumped everything. So she was stuck, married to a ghost. And according to the records, she wasn't alone. Multiple similar cases appear throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. These weren't bad marriages. They were non-existent marriages. Legal fictions are maintained by force of law. And here's where it gets worse. Your children don't know you. You left when your eldest was a toddler. Now she's 10, and you're a stranger who occasionally appears, disrupts the household routine, and then vanishes again. Your son doesn't remember you teaching him anything. His mother taught him to read. The steward taught him to manage accounts. Other knights taught him to fight. You were just ... absent. According to letters from medieval noble families, this created deep rifts between fathers and children. One particularly painful letter from 1401, written by a teenage son to his absent father, reads, "Mother says you are brave. Mother says you serve honorably. But I know only that you are not here, and I have learned to no longer expect you." That's not anger, that's resignation. Acceptance that his father simply doesn't exist in his daily life. And you can't even be angry about it, because he's right. Some knights tried to maintain relationships through letters. They wrote home regularly, asked about the children, advised on managing the estate. But letters take weeks to arrive, months if the campaign has moved. And by the time your advice reaches home, the situation has changed completely. You write, "Tell Robert to focus on his Latin studies." By the time the letter arrives, Robert has already been sent to foster with another family. A decision your wife made 2 months ago, because she couldn't wait for you to respond. You write, "I've sent money from my share of the plunder. Use it to repair the mill. The money never arrives. It was stolen or lost. or you spent it on replacing damaged armor, and back home the mill stays broken. Your tenants can't grind grain, revenue drops, and your wife has to find another solution without you. Let's talk about the money, because here's the brutal economic reality. Being a knight was expensive, ruinously expensive, and the costs never stopped. Armor needed constant maintenance and replacement. Horses were expensive to buy and expensive to keep. You needed weapons, supplies, and servants to maintain your gear. Then there were the campaign costs: food, lodging, and transportation for you and your retinue, and tournament fees, entry costs, equipment, the endless need to keep up appearances. According to financial records from medieval noble households, military service often cost more than it earned. One knight's household accounts from 1356 show he spent £147 on a 6-month campaign and received £83 in wages and plunder. He lost £64, a massive sum, equivalent to years of estate revenue, and he had to do it, because refusing to serve meant losing everything. So where did the money come from? Your estate, which means your wife's management, your children's inheritance. Every campaign you went on, you were literally burning your family's future, and they knew it. According to letters between noble women, there was often tension, sometimes outright conflict, over military expenses. One letter from 1392 describes a wife refusing to sell land to fund her husband's tournament participation. He would trade our children's future for glory that fades before the coin is spent, she wrote to her brother. She was overruled. The land was sold. The husband went to the tournament. He lost in the first round. The money was gone. The land was gone. And his family paid the price. But it wasn't just planned expenses. There was also a ransom. If you were captured in battle, many knights in your family had to pay to get you back, and ransoms were expensive, deliberately so. A knight's ransom could equal several years of estate income, sometimes more than the estate was worth. According to records from the 100 Years' War, families routinely bankrupted themselves paying ransoms. They sold land, borrowed from moneylenders at ruinous rates, pledged future revenues, all to buy back a husband and father who would likely be captured again in the next campaign. One account from 1370 describes a family that paid ransom for the same knight 3 times in 5 years. By the 3rd time, they had nothing left. The estate was mortgaged to the point of collapse, and he was captured a 4th time and died in captivity because they couldn't pay anymore. His family was left destitute. His widow and children survived on charity. That was the cost of chivalry. And here's what really destroys families: the injuries. Not the dramatic ones. Not the wounds that kill you on the battlefield, the ones that cripple you, that leaves you alive but broken. You come home missing a hand, or with a leg that doesn't work right, or with injuries that mean you can never fight again. Suddenly you're not a knight, you're a burden. You can't fulfill your military obligations. Can't earn income through tournaments. Can't even manage your estate effectively. and medieval society had no safety net, no disability payments, no veterans benefits. You were just ... done. According to church records which tracked charitable giving, there was a category for impoverished knights, men who'd served faithfully and been destroyed by it. Some ended up begging. Others lived on charity from monasteries. A few were taken in by family members who resented the burden. One particularly tragic record from 1410 describes a knight who'd lost both legs in battle being cared for by his teenage daughter because his wife had died and his sons had left to seek their own fortunes. He'd given everything for his lord, his country, his honor, and he died alone in poverty in a room that smelled of rot and regret. Ask yourself, would you have been willing to pay that price? To sacrifice your relationship with your wife? To become a stranger to your children? To watch your family's wealth drain away campaign after campaign, tournament after tournament? To risk not just your life, but your family's entire future? Because that's what being a knight actually meant. Not glory, not honor, absence, expense, and the slow destruction of everything you were supposed to be protecting. The songs don't mention this. The poems ignore it. The legends leave it out. But the household accounts don't lie. The letters don't lie. The court records don't lie. Being a knight destroyed families. Systematically, predictably, inevitably. And you knew it. Every time you rode away, every time you strapped on armor you couldn't afford, you knew what it was costing, but you did it anyway. Because what choice did you have? You knew what it was costing, but you didn't know just how much you could lose. Not until you came home one day and discovered that while you were gone, everything had changed, and not in ways you could fix, or fight, or even fully understand. Because absence doesn't just create distance. It creates opportunities for disaster. And disaster in the medieval world was always waiting. Let's talk about what happened when you were gone too long. Your wife, left alone for months or years, had to survive, had to manage, had to make decisions without you. And sometimes those decisions involved other men. We're not talking about romance here. We're talking about survival. A noble woman managing an estate alone was vulnerable, legally, socially, practically. She needed protection, advice, support, so she turned to whoever was available, the steward, a neighboring lord, your brother who stayed home while you went to war. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes those relationships became something more. According to medieval court records, accusations of adultery against knights' wives increased during prolonged military campaigns. Some were true. Some were slandered by enemies, seeing an opportunity. But the pattern is unmistakable. Absence created vulnerability, and vulnerability created complications. Picture this. You return from a 2-year campaign, exhausted, broke, traumatized, and the rumors hit you before you even reach home. Your wife has been seen frequently with your neighbor, Lord Edmund. They've been managing joint property disputes. He's been advising her on estate matters. Nothing improper, necessarily. Just ... close. too close. When you confront her, she's defensive, angry. "Where were you?" she asks. "Who was supposed to help me? Who was supposed to protect our interests while you were off chasing glory?" She's right, and you know it. But it doesn't stop the doubt, the suspicion, the corrosive wondering whether something happened. According to letters from medieval nobles, this paranoia was common and destructive. One letter from 1395 describes a knight who became convinced without evidence that his wife had been unfaithful during his absence. He refused to sleep in the same chamber, treated her with cold contempt, eventually sought an annulment. The church investigated, found no evidence of adultery, denied the annulment, so they stayed married, miserable, living in the same house but in separate worlds. His absence had destroyed the marriage just as surely as actual infidelity would have. And then there were the cases where it was real, where your wife, abandoned for years, genuinely sought companionship elsewhere. Medieval church courts handled these cases, and they reveal a pattern. Women accused of adultery often defended themselves by citing their husband's extended absence. "He has been gone 3 years. I believed him dead. I sought to remarry," or "He left me without provision or protection. I did what I must to survive." The church rarely accepted these defenses. Adultery was adultery. But the records show that judges often struggled with these cases, because technically the women were guilty, but practically they'd been abandoned. One particularly heartbreaking case from 1403 describes a woman whose husband had been gone for 4 years on crusade. She'd received no letters, no money, no indication he was alive. She remarried, believing herself a widow. Then the first husband returned and sued for adultery and bigamy. The church ruled in his favor. She was excommunicated. Her second marriage was annulled. Her children from the second marriage were declared illegitimate, and she was returned to the first husband, who treated her with contempt for the rest of her short life. She tried to survive, and the law destroyed her for it. But it wasn't just wives who strayed. Knights did too. More often, probably, because campaign life offered plenty of opportunities. Camp followers, women in occupied territories, prostitutes who followed armies. And unlike wives left at home, knights faced minimal consequences. A knight who fathered bastard children during campaigns, that was practically expected. Boys will be boys and all that. According to medieval records, many knights had illegitimate children scattered across territories where they'd campaigned. Some acknowledged them, provided some support, brought them home even. This created its own disasters. Picture this. You return home with a 10-year-old boy, your son, from a brief relationship during the war. You expect your wife to accept him, raise him alongside your legitimate children. She's expected to smile, be gracious, pretend this isn't a humiliation. Medieval literature is full of stories about the tensions between legitimate and illegitimate children in noble households, the resentment, the competition for resources, the question of inheritance. Your legitimate son hates his half-brother. Your wife resents the constant reminder of your infidelity. And you're caught in the middle, wondering why everyone can't just get along. Because you didn't just bring home a child. You brought home the physical proof that you'd built another life while you were gone. Let's talk about what happened when your children died. Because they did. Frequently, medieval child mortality was brutal. Disease, accidents, and malnutrition made childhood dangerous, and you were often not there when it happened. According to letters from medieval families, knights frequently received news of children's deaths while on campaign, sometimes months after the fact, because communication was slow and messengers didn't always reach you. Imagine that your child dies, is buried, mourned, and you find out half a year later in a letter. While you're hundreds of miles away, you can't grieve with your family, can't comfort your wife, can't even attend the funeral. You're just ... absent. Again, one letter from 1367, written by a knight who just learned his daughter died 3 months earlier, is almost unbearable to read. I am told Margaret succumbed to fever in March. It is now June. I was not there to hold her hand. I was not there to pray with her. I did not see her buried. I am a father in name only, and now not even that. He deserted his post, rode home without permission. He was court-martialed for abandoning his duties. But he didn't care. His daughter was dead, and he hadn't been there. And here's the cruelest twist. Sometimes your children died because you were a knight, because your military service bankrupted the estate, because there wasn't money for proper food or medicine or heating during winter, because you'd spent their inheritance on armor and horses and tournament fees. Medieval household accounts sometimes revealed this connection. One estate's records from 1388 show a steady decline in household expenses, including food quality and heating fuel, corresponding exactly with the lord's increased military spending. That same year, 2 of his children died during a harsh winter. The coroner's report called it natural causes, but the numbers tell a different story. They died because the house was cold and the food was poor, and the house was cold because their father had spent the money on the war. Did he make the connection? The records don't say, but how could he not? Then there's the issue of your children's futures. Sons needed training, fostering with other noble families, equipment when they came of age. Daughters needed dowries, appropriate marriages, connections. All of that costs money. Money you didn't have because you'd spent it maintaining your knightly status. According to records from medieval noble families, this created catastrophic problems for the next generation. Sons who couldn't afford proper equipment. Daughters who couldn't marry well because their dowries were too small. Your military service and your adherence to chivalric duty actively harmed your children's prospects. One particularly tragic case from 1410 describes a knight's son who couldn't afford armor or a war horse. He tried to serve as a man-at-arms, a lower status position, but was mocked and rejected because of his noble birth. Too poor to be a knight, too noble to be anything else, he ended up as a mercenary. died in some forgotten skirmish. He was buried in an unmarked grave. His father's honor had destroyed his future. And let's talk about what happened when you died. Because eventually you would. In battle, from wounds, from disease on campaign, and your family would be left to pick up the pieces. Your widow would face an immediate financial crisis because your military obligations often came with debts, unpaid loans for equipment, outstanding ransoms, money owed to your lord for various services. According to medieval inheritance laws, those debts passed to your estate, which your widow now had to manage. She might have to sell land immediately just to cover what you owed, and she'd have to do it while grieving, while managing children, while navigating a legal system designed to disadvantage her at every turn, because she wasn't a knight. She didn't have the connections, the respect, the automatic authority. She was just a widow, and widows were vulnerable. Medieval court records are full of widows being cheated, manipulated, or outright robbed. Neighbors seized disputed land, knowing she couldn't defend it. Merchants refused to honor contracts. Debtors disappeared. Your lord might even claim rights to your estate, especially if your heir was underage. Wardship laws allowed lords to manage the estates of minor heirs, and manage often meant exploit for personal profit. According to financial records from noble estates, under wardship, lords routinely stripped assets, cut maintenance, and returned estates to heirs in terrible condition. Your widow could watch helplessly as everything you'd built was looted by the very people supposed to protect it. One case from 1385 describes a widow who petitioned the king because her lord had seized 2/3 of her late husband's estate under wardship laws, even though her son was 16 and nearly of age. The king sided with the lord. Legal, he said. She and her son were left with barely enough to survive. That was the protection widows and orphans received. And here's what really destroys me about all this. You knew, on some level, you knew what you were risking. Every time you rode away, you knew you might not come back. Every time you spent money on equipment instead of your family, you knew the trade-off, but you did it anyway. Because the alternative, refusing to serve, abandoning your knightly duties, would have destroyed your family in different ways. Lose your lands for refusing service? Your family starves. Be branded a coward? Your children are disgraced, unmarriageable. You were trapped between two impossible choices. Serve and destroy your family slowly. Refuse and kill them immediately. So you chose service. Because at least that way you could tell yourself you were doing the honorable thing, even as it killed everything you loved. Some knights tried to prepare for this. They made wills. Detailed, careful wills are trying to protect their families after death, but will only work if there's something left to inherit. And if you'd spent years draining the estate to fund military service, the will was just words. One will from 1399 is particularly painful. A knight leaves everything to his wife and children with detailed instructions on managing the estate, educating the children, and maintaining family honor. The estate inventory taken after his death reveals why the will was so detailed. Total assets, 47 pounds. Total debts, 183 pounds. He'd left them nothing but obligations. His widow had to sell everything: land, livestock, and household goods. It wasn't enough. She had to borrow more just to settle his debts. His children were left with nothing. No inheritance, no prospects. Just a noble name they couldn't afford to maintain. His service had destroyed them completely. And here's the final bitter truth. Most of society didn't care. Your family's suffering was just the cost of maintaining the system. Knights had to serve, had to fight, had to maintain their status. If that destroyed families, well, that was unfortunate. But it was necessary. The songs praised your sacrifice. The church blessed your service. Your Lord rewarded your loyalty. Nobody mentioned your wife managing alone, your children growing up without a father, your estate crumbling under debt, because those things didn't matter, not to the stories, not to the system. Only your honor mattered, your glory, your name. And if your family paid the price for that, that was their purpose, their duty, to suffer silently while you pursue glory. So when you think about medieval knights, remember, behind every man in armor was a family falling apart. Behind every heroic deed was a wife managing impossible burdens. Behind every tournament victory was a child who didn't have enough to eat. The cost of chivalry wasn't paid by the knights. It was paid by the people they left behind. Your wife, who became a stranger. Your children, who forgot your face. Your estate, bled dry by the endless hunger of war. This is the truth beneath the armor, the price of the title, and you paid it. Not with your life on the battlefield, but with everything that made life worth living. Your family, your home, your future, gone, while you were away chasing glory that faded the moment the songs ended. That was the real cost of being a knight. And unlike a wound from battle, this one never healed. And so the night falls quiet, carrying their whispers into silence. If you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you never miss another whisper in the night. Until we meet again, good night.